got nasty or tried to get nasty. And I'm talking about the presumption of innocence before guilt. That's fundamental. I'm talking about habeas corpus, whereby you can't just be arrested in Britain and chucked in prison for years and years before going, to a magistrate or a court and facing a charge. And I'm also talking, since Magna Carta, about our right to be judged by 12 of our peers, to have the option to be, to go to a jury trial. And the European, in nearly every other EU country, those three basic provisions don't exist. Because in Europe, we don't really have a very happy, long established pattern of democracy. It's not all that long ago that most of Europe was fascist, for goodness sake, and the other half of it was communist. And I fear that all those ancient rights and liberties and freedoms are being taken away from us and being replaced by human rights charters. And the great difference is that in a human rights culture, it's the state that gives you freedoms, gives you the ability to do things, but it's the state that also has the power to take those away when it wants to. I'd much rather live in a country where I'm born a free man and where I can do anything I want to do unless there's a law that prevents it. And I genuinely fear that everything that we've built up in this country since Magna Carta, and I think that Britain has always been perceived to be a place where you can come and live and work that is actually about as fair as you can get around the world, and I think that will rapidly disappear in the next few years. So I'm absolutely terrified of what's happening on every level, and I think that those that went before us and made those great sacrifices, if they could see what we've done with their legacy, my goodness me, they really would turn in their graves.
Let me ask you about Britain specifically. You have more cameras per capita than any nation in the world. And you really do have this, I would call it a soft police state at this point. But if anybody says anything directionally that looks out of order to headquarters with these cameras, there's immediate police dispatched. What are your thoughts as you see that?
I hate it. I absolutely hate it. I hate the cameras everywhere. I hate the fact that we're not even allowed to go and hunt foxes anymore. There's a piece of legislation that prohibits us from doing that. I hate the fact that I can't even in my own club in London go upstairs after lunch to a smoking room and have a cigar. I hate the extent to which the state wants to control every aspect of our lives, wants to monitor us, wants to put us on DNA databases, and there is no evidence that any of this is dealing with the real criminals, that any of this is improving our quality of life, is taking away the risk of us, being assaulted or being mugged. And we're living in an incredible society where people who commit appalling violent acts, sexual acts, go to prison for ever shorter periods of time. And this whole apparatus with the cameras and this soft police state evermore bears down upon people who traditionally have been law-abiding, police-supporting, and state-supporting. And I think there is a massive sense of alienation in what used to be called Middle England. Just ordinary people going about their work who basically thought they lived in a free and fair country, who trusted the police, who went about their business and went through their lives, hardly ever having any brushes with authority. But now, you can drive your motor car. I could drive from here to Dover, which is about 70 miles, and by the time I get to Dover, I could have been clocked by 5 speed cameras or whatever else it is. So there is a real sense of alienation. And I have to say that, I left school in the early 80s, and I worked in my early times in a country that was revolutionizing. I mean, there was a Thatcher revolution in Britain where we suddenly got our self-confidence back. We suddenly got our belief back. We became a country again that whether it was Japan or America or wherever it may be, they wanted to invest in London, and banks were happy to come here, and we felt good about ourselves. And I'm now living in a country that feels very badly about itself, ill at ease within its own society, distrustful of its own politicians, and increasingly not even trusting its own police force. And that, we've got a lot to do to reverse this stuff. But my contention is that we will never reverse any of this stuff, all the while we're part of political union with its HQ in Brussels. Because already they're making 75% of our laws. 75% of our laws are not made for the men and women that we vote for in centre Westminster. They're drafted in secret by Brussels bureaucrats. And it's not until Britain has the confidence and the courage to get back that ability to act in our own best interest that we can begin to tackle some of these other problems too.
This is all very Orwellian.
It is, totally.
And nightmarish, to be frank.
Yeah, it's horrific.
Why have you chosen, Nigel, to put this target on your back? Why have you chosen that?
Well, that is a good question, and it's one my children ask me, and it's one my wife asks me, and it's one my parents ask me. Why work 7 days a week, all the hours God sends? Why take the abuse? Why be fearful that every telephone call you make is now being intercepted and listened to? Why do it? Well, if I wasn't doing it, who else would? Who else would? I mean, there's a handful of people in the British Conservative Party. There's a handful of people in the British Labour Party that have the courage to stand up and speak. But whatever they do, they're crushed by their own party machines. If there was someone better than me out there doing all of this, well, that would be fine. But there aren't. I'm afraid there just aren't enough people with enough courage to stand up and do it. But what encourages me is, whilst amongst our career politicians and civil servants, I might be despised, every day when I go about my business and I catch the train into London and I go into the pub for a pint and whatever I do, every day, increasingly, numbers of ordinary, real people, people that do jobs and pay taxes and bring up children, people that want to be law-abiding, people that care about this country and care about our history, increasingly they're the ones that come up to me and say, Nigel, thank goodness someone's out there speaking up for us, and that's good enough for me. I know that we're changing opinion. I know that we're getting the public to understand the things that we're saying, and risky though it may be, and hard though it may be at times, that for me is reward in itself. And I shall look forward. I shall look forward to the day that we've won back our independence and we'll have the biggest party London's ever seen.
Let me ask you in a different way, because you don't strike me as somebody to cower in the shadows, and that you would be able to look yourself in the mirror if you didn't do what you feel so compelled to do, which is to stand up against this tyranny. But directionally, if it ends badly, and it ends in a total fascist, communist state, and somebody like you is taken and just eliminated, let's say disposed of humanely, it almost sounds to me like you wouldn't have it any other way, because you couldn't look yourself in the mirror or do otherwise. And you've almost said, I'm a casualty of war, worst case scenario, but I have to stand up against this tyranny.
Yes, I mean, I just have to be true to myself on this. I mean, I hadn't planned any of this, for goodness sake. You know, I was working in financial services. I was bringing up a family. I wasn't even involved in politics. You know, this wasn't part of my game plan for life. But I just feel so strongly that I've got a contribution to make here. And frankly, whilst I do accept there are risks and things could go horribly wrong, hey, I wouldn't want to live in a country that wasn't free anyway. It wouldn't interest me. So I think it's worth the risk.
Let me ask you in closing, Nigel, because you've been so generous with your time. For our global listeners, for people in the United States, for people listening in Asia, China, you know, all over Asia, and India, etc., what would you say to those people? Because you've seen the rapid collapse of freedoms in the European Union, in Britain, and you've seen this police state begin to envelop the people, because this is beginning to be imported in the United States, right? Just to be on the watch and to try to prevent this as early as possible, to use every stall tactic at your disposal. What would you say to those peoples around the globe?
What I would say to peoples right around the globe is be careful, be on your guard. Make sure that if politicians and leaders propose to you the establishment of free trade zones and free trade areas, make sure they stay as free trade areas. Because what's happened to us stealthily, whilst being planned all along, is something that was sold as being good for business, has turned into a political union, a political nightmare that none of us have ever endorsed. And there are people out there who don't just want one European government. There are people out there, mad though it may seem, who ultimately would like one world government. And I think the one thing history teaches us is that certainly within the European time zone, the best safeguard of our freedoms, not just for Europe, but for the impact it has upon the entire world, is democracy. Democracy is the safeguard. because in a proper democratic system, you can get rid of bad guys and replace them with good guys. So this has happened to us. Don't let it happen to you.
Nigel Farage, co-president of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy Group and national spokesman for the United Kingdom's Independent Party. Thank you so much for joining us on King World News and for being so gracious with your time.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for joining us at kingworldnews.com. Remember to tune in next week where we will have more interviews with the top people in the world.